Welcome everyone to episode 63 of Ohio Unsolved. I'm your host Matthew, and I've got a scary unsolved murder for you guys today. But first, I'd like to welcome Harry Culkin to the Patreon. Thank you for subscribing, and I hope you enjoy the bonus episodes. Now let's just get right into today's episode. Everyone sit back, make sure to lock your doors and windows, and get ready for Ohio Unsolved. This first story is a little graphic, so listener discretion is advised. The murder of the Grimes sisters is a still unsolved double murder that occurred in Chicago, Illinois on December 28, 1956, in which two sisters named Barbara and Patricia Grimes, then aged 15 and 12, disappeared while traveling from a Brighton Park movie theater to their home in McKinley Park. Their disappearance initiated one of the largest missing persons investigations in the history of Chicago. The girls' nude bodies were discovered alongside a deserted road in Willow Springs on January 22, 1957. Although the sisters' autopsy reports concluded that they had been murdered within 5 hours of their last confirmed sighting, and that both girls had died of secondary shock, numerous individuals attested to having seen the girls alive in the weeks between the night of December 28th and the subsequent discovery of their bodies. On December 28th, 1956, 2 of the 7 children born to Joseph and Loretta Grimes, sisters Barbara, 15, and Patricia, 12, opted to view a screening of the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender at a Brighton Park theater. Barbara and Patricia have been described as being inseparable sisters and attentive students at the Thomas Kelly High School and St. Maurice Catholic Elementary School that they respectively attended. They are also known to have been devoted fans of Elvis, and both had recently joined his official fan club. This particular occasion was the 11th time that the girls had both viewed this particular film of his, and the sisters are known to have left their residence at approximately 7:30 p.m., having promised their mother that they would be home before midnight. The Brighton Theater was located 1.5 miles from the girls' McKinley Park home, and Barbara and Patricia are presumed to have had approximately $2.50 in their possession at the time that they left their house, with Barbara having been instructed to keep 50 cents of this money in the zipper of her wallet should the 2 girls opt to view the second screening of the film scheduled to be shown at the theater that evening. It is unknown how the sisters actually traveled to the Brighton Theater on this particular day, although they had invariably either walked or traveled by bus to this destination on previous occasions. A school friend of Patricia, named Dorothy Weinert, would later inform investigators that she had been seated behind the girls with her own younger sister during the movie. Although Weinert and her sister had left the theater at the intermission of the double feature screened at the theater that night, at approximately 9:30 p.m. As they had done so, Dorothy saw the Grimes sisters queuing to purchase popcorn. The two had seemed in good spirits, and neither Weinert's sister noticed anything untoward in their demeanor. Both sisters stayed to view the second screening of Love Me Tender, thus meaning that they would be expected to return home at approximately 11:45 p.m. When the girls had not arrived home by midnight, their mother, Loretta, sent their older sister, Teresa, and brother, Joey, to wait by the bus stop located closest to the family home for their arrival. After 3 successive buses had driven by without either girl getting off at the designated stop, both siblings returned home. Having by this stage already unsuccessfully contacted the girls' friends in the hope that their daughters may be at one of these addresses, and upon seeing the return of Teresa and Joey to the home without their sisters, Loretta Grimes filed missing persons reports on her daughters with the Chicago Police Department at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. The disappearance of their sisters sparked one of the largest missing persons cases in the history of Cook County. A citywide search for the girls was quickly initiated, to which hundreds of police officers were subsequently assigned full-time. Cook County officers were assisted by colleagues from surrounding suburbs, and a task force devoted solely to locating the sisters was formed, with a ground search initiated on December 29th being bolstered by hundreds of local volunteers. The police conducted door-to-door canvassing throughout Brighton Park, and numerous canals and rivers were dredged. In addition, more than 15,000 flyers were distributed to local homes, and parishioners of the Sisters' Church offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to their whereabouts. As a result of this coordinated investigation, 300,000 people would be questioned, with some 2,000 individuals subjected to serious interrogation pertaining to their potential culpability, although the 2 arrests and charges brought against individuals who confessed to the crime subsequently collapsed. One individual, Edward Bedwell, asserted that he had been coerced into giving a confession after being subjected to a prolonged interrogation. Despite police efforts and extensive media appeals producing many reported sightings of the girls, little in the way of hard evidence was yielded, although several teenagers who had been at the Brighton Theater on December 28th did inform the investigators that they had seen the sisters talking with, then entering a car driven by a young man whose physical appearance had been similar to that of Elvis Presley. The vehicle described by these eyewitnesses were consistently described as being a Mercury model. Prior to the implementation of the task force, and despite protests from the girls' parents, several investigators initially assigned to the case theorized that the sisters had either run away from home or were voluntarily staying with boyfriends. Although the sisters were front-page news by December 31st, their disappearance would only be seriously considered as a missing persons case, and thus appropriately treated as such by investigators after approximately 1 week had passed without family and friends receiving any form of contact from either girl. Nonetheless, extensive media appeals were conducted, imploring both sisters to return home, and for any eyewitnesses to contact the police. Resultingly, numerous alleged sightings of the sisters would be reported to the police as late January 9th, and these reports often described one or both of the girls as having been seen in various business establishments. These sightings supported several investigators' initial theories that the girls had opted to leave home of their own accord. Theories also abounded that the sisters may possibly have traveled to Nashville, Tennessee to see Elvis in concert, or that they had simply left their home of their own volition as a means of emulating Presley's lifestyle. In the event that her daughters had actually been kidnapped, Loretta Grimes publicly pleaded, "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me," adding, "I'll forgive them from the bottom of my heart." On January 19th, 1957, an official statement was issued from Presley's Graceland estate. This televised statement read, "If you are a good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." Elvis is also known to have made a direct radio plea to the Grimes sisters, imploring the girls to return home to their mother. On January 22, 1957, following a rapid thaw of recent snowfall, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott spotted what he later described as being these flesh-colored things behind a guardrail as he drove along a rural country road named German Church Road, approximately 200 feet east of County Line Road in unincorporated Willow Springs. Initially unsure of the origin of what he had seen, and believing the forms may be mannequins, Prescott later returned to the site with his wife Marie, who fainted upon taking a closer look at what her husband had earlier seen. The forms were actually the nude, frozen bodies of the Grimes sisters, and the Prescotts immediately reported their findings to the Willow Springs Police Department. The girls' bodies lay upon a flat, horizontal section of snow-covered ground directly behind the guardrail, which extended for just 10 feet before the incline of the embankment of Devil's Creek. Barbara lay on her left side with her legs drawn slightly up toward her torso. Patricia lay on her back with her body covering her sister's head, and her own head turned sharply to the right. It is believed the sisters had most likely been driven to this location in a car, with their bodies then being dragged or lifted out of the vehicle, then placed or thrown behind the guardrail. 3 wounds resembling those typically inflicted by ice picks were discovered upon Barbara's chest, and injuries resembling blunt force trauma were visible on her face and head, while numerous injuries resembling bruises were discovered upon Patricia's face and body. The girl's father, Joseph Grimes, was driven to the crime scene to formally identify both bodies. Following Joseph's initial positive identification of the bodies, over 160 police officers from several suburban Chicago police departments, assisted by numerous local volunteers, conducted a search of the crime scene with the additional assistance of the forest preserves. This search uncovered little or no real evidence linked to the crime. Any potential link any item discovered at the crime scene had to the murders has never been determined, and the search itself was later criticized due to those organizing the search allowing untrained individuals to trample over any evidence that may have been at the location. The descendants' autopsies were performed the day following their discovery. These autopsies would be performed by 3 experienced forensic pathologists who, following a 5-hour examination of each body, were unable to reach agreement on either a date or a cause of death. These experts did determine via an examination of the sisters' stomach contents that contained the approximate proportions of the last known meals and subsequent snacks the sisters had eaten on the evening of December 28th, that both girls had most likely died within approximately 5 hours of the time they had last been seen alive at the Brighton Theater, thus fixing the most likely time of death in each instance to have either been the late evening of December 28th or the early morning of December 29th. The cause of death in each case was ruled as being a combination of shock and exposure, although each pathologist reached this conclusion via a process of eliminating other causes. In addition, these experts concluded that many of the wounds discovered upon the girls' bodies had most likely been inflicted by rodents, with the actual puncture wounds having most likely been inflicted after death. No obviously fatal wounds were discovered upon either girl's body, and toxicology reports revealed that neither girl had been drunk, drugged, or poisoned prior to death. No items of the sisters' clothing were ever found, although their bodies were described by the pathologists as being markedly clean. The autopsies would also discover that Barbara had likely engaged in sexual intercourse, either consensually or unconsensually, more than likely unconsensually, around the time of her death, although no evidence of forcible molestation was found. The official death certificates of both Barbara and Patricia would list their cause of death as being murder, the specific means of which in both cases was listed as being secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures, which had reduced each girl's body temperature below the critical level compatible with life. One of the coroners to perform the autopsies, Walter McCarran, surmised the sisters' bodies had lain undiscovered behind the guardrail on German Church Road for many days before their eventual discovery, stating that the bodies' markedly preserved condition, given the time interval between their disappearance and discovery, had been due to the frigid temperatures in the weeks prior to January 22nd, adding that this had been due to recent snowfalls and the frigid climate. McCarran also concluded the girls' bodies had lain undiscovered for more than 3 weeks because of a layer of snow had blanketed the area on January 9th, and that this snowfall had rapidly melted in the days immediately prior to their discovery. Despite these official conclusions, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with the official time of death, later stating to the media that there had been numerous marks of violence on those girls' faces, strongly indicative of their being the recipients of violence as opposed to the post-mortem rodent infestation. Gloss also contended that a thin layer of ice found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies indicated that they had most likely been alive until at least January 7th, since only after that date would there have been a sufficient snowfall to react with the girls' natural body heat in such a climate, and thus create the layer of ice discovered upon their bodies in this location. Gloss contended this proved their bodies had been warm when they had been deposited beside German Church Road, since only after January 7th had there been sufficient snow to create such an ice layer upon and around their bodies. In addition to these facts, Gloss also stated that both girls had been subjected to sexual assaults throughout their period of captivity, adding that the autopsy conducted upon Patricia had discovered semen within the vaginal fluid swabbed from her body, and that curdled milk had also been found in Barbara's stomach, when she is not known to have drunk milk either at home or at the cinema on the evening of December 28th. The chief investigator of the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, strongly believed an official suspect in the case named Edward Bedwell had been the individual who had committed the sisters' murders. He also asserted that the wound marks noted upon the girls' bodies in their autopsies had neither been adequately investigated or considered. He would also further assert his opinion that the wounding and assault marks had been evidence that the girls had been beaten prior to their murder, and in tandem with the evidence of sexual activity, were thus in line with the claims Bedwell provided to the investigators in his January 1957 interrogations. Gloss would also claim that investigators had refused to disclose these and potentially other lurid details of the case due to a possible desire to protect the girls' reputations and or spare their mother's feelings. Similar allegations would be repeated in later years by others, some of whom claimed to have both seen the original case files and to have interviewed numerous McKinley Park residents who alleged both girls had been in the habit of spending free time outside of bars on 36th Street and Archer Avenue, where they regularly persuaded older men to purchase alcoholic drinks to be delivered to them outside the premises. Despite Gloss's insistence that the pathologists had taken the girls off Madison Street and put them into respectability, investigators connected to the case continued to insist that there had been no evidence of either girl being disreputable or the recipient of extreme violence or sexual molestation prior to their death. After refusing to retract his statements, Gloss was fired by Coroner Walter E. McCarran on February 15th, although Gloss would insist his firing had been politically motivated. Nonetheless, Gloss would later be deputized by Sheriff Joseph D. Lohman, who concurred with Gloss's conviction that the girls had likely been beaten and tortured by a sexual predator who had lured them into his vehicle upon an innocent pretense to continue to work on the case without pay. Between the last confirmed sighting of the sisters at the Brighton Theater on December 28, 1956, and the subsequent discovery of their bodies 25 days later, several unconfirmed sightings of the sisters both in and outside of Chicago were reported to the Chicago Police Department. The most widely reported sightings included the following. Numerous people stated to investigators that they had seen the girls boarding a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue, heading east into the city after the screening. Those who reported this sighting to police included the bus driver. The sisters allegedly alighted at Western Avenue, approximately halfway between the theater and their home, at approximately 11:05 p.m. Why the sisters would exit the bus at Western Avenue is unknown. A young man named Roger Menard informed investigators that he had also attended the December 28th screening of Love Me Tender, having sat behind Barbara and Patricia Grimes and close to Weinhardt. According to Menard, he had left the theater approximately 1 minute before the sisters, who had walked down Archer Avenue a short distance behind him before a late-model green Buick had stopped alongside them. The girls hesitated before continuing to walk. Just past 42nd Street, with the sisters by this stage walking ahead of him, a black 1949 Mercury occupied by two teenage boys pulled alongside the girls, although they simply giggled before continuing to walk in the direction of their home. Two teenage boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro informed investigators that while they had been driving through McKinley Park at approximately 11:30 p.m. on December 28th, they had seen the sisters on 35th Street. Reportedly, the two had been giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other near Seeley and Damon Avenues, with one youth exclaiming to the other that they were those two Grimes sisters as they passed them. At this point, the girls would have been approximately 2 blocks from their home. A security guard named Jack Franklin later informed investigators that he had offered directions to the two girls on the morning of December 29th, approximately 12 hours after they had left the theater. This verbal exchange had allegedly occurred near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues, and Franklin later concluded that the girls had been the Grimes sisters, adding the sole reason he had recalled this conversation was that both girls had both been rude and abrupt to him. On the same date of Franklin's alleged sighting of Barbara and Patricia, a friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported to investigators that she had seen the sisters approximately 2:30 p.m. walking westward on Archer Avenue, 2 blocks from Damon Avenue. A classmate of Patricia's named Catherine Borak was adamant that she had seen Patricia walking past a restaurant that she had been inside in the early evening of December 29th. According to Borak, Patricia had been in the company of 2 unidentified young girls. The sighting was followed by another 6 hours later by a cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago, who claimed she had seen both girls at 12:45 a.m. A railroad conductor named Bernard Norton reported seeing the 2 girls aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in north suburban Glenview. According to Norton, the 2 girls had been searching for 2 sailors named Terry and Larry. On December 30th at 5:40 a.m., the owner of the D&L restaurant said that he had seen both girls with Patricia apparently too drunk or too sick to walk without staggering, accompanied by official suspect Edward Bedwell. This location was over 5.5 miles from the Brighton Theater. A clerk at the Claremont Hotel, after viewing the bodies at a mortuary, likewise identified the sisters as having checked into the hotel on this date. On January 1st, 1957, the girls were reported as having been seen aboard a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Damon Avenue. The following week, a night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street refused two girls a room because of their age. This clerk believed the girls in question had been the Grimes sisters. On January 3rd, 3 employees at an Inglewood Crescent department store claimed to have seen both girls listening to music at the store's record counter. Each employee stated that the sisters had been listening to music by Elvis. Adding credence to the theory that both sisters had run away to Nashville, on January 17th, a woman named Pearl Neville contacted investigators to state that she had met both girls in a Nashville restroom on January 9th, and that she had accompanied them to a state employment agency to search for work. According to Neville, both girls had been in what she described as being a tired, bedraggled condition. A clerk at this agency would later identify the sisters from photographs, also recalling that both girls had used the surname Grimes in the application forms that they had populated. In the early hours of January 14th, the parents of a classmate of Patricia Grimes named Sandra Tolston received 2 separate anonymous telephone calls. During the first call, nobody at the other end spoke. Picking up the second phone call approximately 15 minutes later, Sandra's mother, Anne, heard a frightened and depressed young female voice asking, "Is this you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" Before Anne could bring her daughter to the phone, the call was ended. Mrs. Tolston informed the investigators of her conviction that the caller had been Patricia Grimes. Edward Lee Bedwell was a 21-year-old semi-literate drifter originally from Tennessee, who had been evicted from his family's estate East Garfield Park home on November 1956. And in the weeks preceding the Grimes sisters' murder, had occasionally earned money by working as a part-time dishwasher in a Chicago Skid Row restaurant. Bedwell was a tall individual who allegedly bore a strong resemblance to Elvis Presley. According to John and Minnie Duros, the owner of the restaurant where Bedwell had been employed, he and another young male had been at her premises in the company of 2 girls who physically resembled the Grimes sisters in the early morning of December 30th. Duros conveyed this information to police on January 24th. Bedwell was arrested thereafter and subjected to interrogation for 3 days. Initially, he was insistent that John and Minnie Duros and a patron named Renee Eccles, who had corroborated the Duros eyewitness statements, were mistaken in their identification of the girls he had been in the company of on December 30th. However, he was formally charged with the sisters' murders on January 27, 1957, having signed a 14-page confession in which he said that he and a 28-year-old acquaintance named William Cole Willingham had indeed been in the company of the Grimes sisters on December 30th. He stated that they were together until January 7th, typically drinking in various West Madison Street Skid Row saloons. According to Bedwell, after several days in the girls' willing company, shortly after he and his companion had fed the sisters hot dogs, they had extensively beaten both girls before throwing their nude bodies into a snow-filled ditch when both sisters had refused their sexual advances. Upon reading Bedwell's confession, Loretta Grimes was quoted as stating, "It's a lie. My girls wouldn't be on West Madison Street. They didn't even know where that was." Willingham admitted that he had been in the company of Bedwell and 2 girls in the early hours of December 30th, but denied that the girls had been the Grimes sisters. He also emphatically denied any involvement in their murders. Bedwell himself would later recant the confession that he had provided to investigators, stating that he had only provided a confession after being held in custody for 4 days in the mistaken belief the police would subsequently release him if he did so. The autopsy reports upon both girls also supported Bedwell's recantation, as no alcohol or hot dogs were found in either victim's blood or digestive systems, nor had the girls been beaten to death. Furthermore, Bedwell is also known to have been clocked in at Ajax Consolidated Company, his place of employment from 4:19 p.m. on December 28th to 12:30 a.m. on December 29th, covering the most likely time of the sisters' abduction, with further records confirming Bedwell had been working in Cicero on the date he said he had murdered them. On February 6, Bedwell was freed on a $20,000 bond paid for by an individual from Champion. The same year of his acquittal, Bedwell would be tried and acquitted of the 1956 rape of a 13-year-old girl in Oak Hill, Florida. He died in November of 1972. Max Fleig was a 17-year-old suspect in the sisters' murders. Initially considered one of the prime suspects, due to his age, Max was protected by a contemporary Illinois law that prevented juveniles from subjection to polygraph tests. Nonetheless, Chicago Police Captain Ralph Pettigrew persuaded the teenager to submit to an unofficial polygraph test, which Fleig voluntarily undertook. In the course of this unofficial polygraph test, Fleig allegedly confessed to the murders. With no legal means of using this test as evidence against him, police were forced to release him without charge. In addition, police were unable to charge him with the murders due to there being a lack of physical evidence corroborating his confession that he had kidnapped and subsequently killed the sisters. Fleig was later jailed for the unrelated murder of another young woman. Walter Kranz, a 53-year-old steamfitter and self-proclaimed psychic, phoned a switchboard operator at Chicago's Central Police Complaint Room on January 15th to inform the operator of his conviction that both sisters were deceased and that their bodies could be found in an unincorporated area of Lyons Township. Kranz refused to disclose his name to the operator in the phone call, simply stating that he had experienced this revelation in a dream, before terminating the call. Nonetheless, the operator was able to trace the call to a location close to his home. The park described by Kranz in his telephone call would prove to be approximately 1 mile from the true location where the girls' bodies would be just found 1 week later. When questioned, Kranz informed police that several members of his family and ancestors possessed psychic powers, and that he had experienced this particular vision after a night of heavy drinking. Although initially considered by police to be their number one suspect in the murders, and with handwriting experts also determining that he may have written a ransom note received by the girl's mother prior to the discovery of her daughter's bodies, Kranz denied any involvement in the sisters' abduction and murder. After being subjected to multiple interrogations, he was released. In the weeks between the disappearance and subsequent discovery of her daughter's bodies, Loretta Grimes was unable to work and thus earn money to raise her children and pay the mortgage upon her home. Friends and neighbors of the Grimes family, plus classmates and teachers of the sisters, organized various initiatives to raise funds for the family. Additional funds would be raised via the local press and council, with the donations raised via all various methods, ranging from 50 cents to $500. Consequently, all funds raised would enable the Grimes family to both pay the remaining mortgage on their home and bury Barbara and Patricia's bodies. Following a wake held in the girls' memory on January 25th, a holy mass conducted at St. Maurice Church, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were laid to rest at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois on January 28th. All fees for the service were waived by the funeral home, and the sisters are buried side by side. Among those to serve pallbearers at this service were classmates of Barbara's. In May of 1957, Loretta Grimes received an anonymous telephone call from an individual who claimed to have undressed and killed her daughters. Although the Grimes family had received numerous hoax phone calls following the girls' disappearance, this particular caller having ridiculed police efforts to affix blame upon suspects such as Edward Bedwell, ended his phone call with information indicating he may indeed have been the perpetrator. "I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed at the feet." The caller then laughed before terminating the call. 1 year after the murder of her daughters, Loretta Grimes publicly stated her conviction her daughters had been murdered by an individual they had known, stating that although the weather had been bitterly cold on the night of their abduction, Barbara and Patricia would never have entered a vehicle driven by an individual unknown to them, regardless of any discomfort. Joseph Lohman, the Cook County Sheriff who strongly believed the Grimes sisters had been beaten, tortured, and murdered by a sexual predator who had lured them into a vehicle on the evening of their disappearance, died of natural causes in 1969. At the time of his death, Lohman was the dean of the School of Criminology in Berkeley. On the 18th anniversary of the disappearance of the Grimes sisters, Ernest Biotto, the sole detective who had been involved in the investigation of the girls' murders from the very beginning, and who remained assigned to the investigation, again announced to the media the police had no credible suspects in the case. Officially, the murders of the Grimes sisters remain unsolved, although this is an open case. The Grimes sisters' younger brother, James Grimes, who is just 11 at the time of his sister's murder, stated in 2013 that he welcomed what he saw as a public reopening of the case, stating, "I just assumed it was never going to be solved, but maybe there's hope." In 2013, a retired West Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson began a personal investigation into the case. Johnson, considered by many to be an expert on this case, had become interested in the Grimes sisters case in 2010 when he had been researching a book that he had been writing about the city's history. Having extensively researched the case, Johnson has stated that his conviction that the case is still a solvable one, but only with public assistance, and that he believes that the perpetrator of this crime had been a 23-year-old self-confessed child killer named Charles Leroy Melquist, who had been considered a suspect in the sisters' abduction and murder in 1957. Melquist had been convicted of the September 1958 murder of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott, whom he had known prior to her murder, and whose decapitated body had been found 2 months after her disappearance, less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters' bodies had been discovered. Following the discovery of Scott's body, investigators had noted similarities in this murder and body disposal, and that of the Grimes sisters. Nonetheless, Melquist was never questioned as to his potential culpability in the Grimes sisters' murders, and his attorney had forbidden him to be subject to questioning. The day after the body of Bonnie Lee Scott was discovered, Loretta Grimes received a phone call from an individual who on this occasion claimed responsibility for Scott's murder. On this occasion, the caller had stated, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one the cops won't solve, and they're not going to fix blame onto Bedwell or Barry Cook." Loretta Grimes would remain adamant until her death this caller had been the same individual who had contacted her in May of 1957 and had revealed the deformity upon one of her daughter's feet, which had never been released to the press or the public, stating, "I will never forget that voice." Charles Melquist was never charged with his alleged involvement in the deaths of the Grimes sisters, and he died in 2010. I've got one more story for you guys today, and you guessed it, it comes from YourGhostStories.com. So let's just get right into the story. I live in Boardman, Ohio, and there are 3 stories that I have since the summer of 2000 that I would like to explain. Don't doubt my memory either. I remember everything perfectly, and I am 100% sure that this is accurate. I want to post it to see if anyone else had anything similar happen. I know it's a lot, but just read one of the 3 bullets if you don't want to read a lot. 1. One summer night. This is the first incident that made me actually consider the possibility that what people call ghosts actually exist. I was in my basement around 9 p.m. playing a keyboard facing the wall. I saw someone out of my peripheral vision walking toward me. I could see all the features of a human, a head, arms, and legs moving blatantly, and even the walking motion was slightly exaggerated. It walked right up and stood next to me as if it was trying to get my attention non-verbally. When I looked, nothing was there. I was a little disturbed, but eventually shrugged it off. Now later that same night, at around 1 a.m., I was sitting on the computer in the dining room for quite some time. Everyone was asleep, and I had been sitting still for about an hour and a half. I got up to use the restroom, and when I returned, I passed the desk that I was sitting at and headed for the kitchen. This is when I realized that the fan was moving very slowly, as if someone just tapped it a second ago. It was moving the wrong way. Things became creepy at this point. I then heard an overabundance of little noises all over the house that night, like the house settling. Number 2, someone in my room. This began in the earlier part of 2002, let's say March. My parents and I were the only ones living in my house at the time. While in bed at night, I would hear a noise every once in a while that sounded as if someone was standing across my room, digging their foot into my carpet. It was a scraping or rubbing noise. Just rub your foot back and forth into your own carpet to see what I mean. This scraping sounded varied in duration and forcefulness. Sometimes it was very loud and fast, but sometimes it was more subtle and slow. This would happen almost every night for about 2 months. During these 2 months, a few other things happened that were even stranger. One night, I heard something slide across my floor very quickly, making the same carpet friction sound, and I ran to my bed. My bed shook. Another night, I heard someone dance or hop down the hallway, hitting a squeaky spot in the floor several times. I'm sure it wasn't another member of the family just getting up. I would have heard my parents' door open. It's very loud. Another night, I was lying there listening to the unusual feet scraping when something hit my dresser very hard. Imagine kicking your dresser as hard as you can with shoes on. I even heard the dresser's knobs dingle. Remember, this was right next to me, 5 feet away. I was very scared and didn't move. Then about 10 minutes later, someone knocked on my window twice. I still hear the carpet friction once in a while anyway in the house to this day. Number 3, a loud bang. This happened in 2003. I was sitting in my basement on the computer late at night. Everyone was asleep. I then heard a very loud bang on the floor upstairs that came from the dining room. I immediately went upstairs to the location and I found nothing out of the ordinary. It seemed to me as if someone had picked up the desk chair in that room and dropped it from about 2 feet height, which is loud. It was the only object in the room that could have made this noise. These 3 incidents are the main stories that I have. There are several smaller things that happened to me. Things had fallen off the shelves many times over the years. The toilet would sometimes flush on its own. Other people who have visited my house reported seeing black balls floating around my basement. A girl that I was watching TV with one night told me that while I was in the bathroom, someone walked down the steps who she thought was me, but nobody was there. Another person once saw a human shape walk past him in the mirror in the basement. When our dog died, each one of us, my parents and I, heard the same bark just once come from inside the house the very next day. If you're reading this and are thinking, wow, that happened to me, then please let me know via comments. I would like to know if someone else had any of this before. Well, that is going to do it for today's episode. I hope that you guys enjoyed the stories, and if you could, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. A 5-star review really does help others find this podcast. Also, make sure to share with friends and family. Don't forget to join us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe on YouTube. If you do enjoy the podcast, please consider helping to support the show through Patreon, with monthly bonus episodes being available from the $5 tier. Once again, thank you all for listening, and make sure to keep your doors and windows locked, and stay ready for Ohio Unsolved.